Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Resilience video series here at Arthur Cox. Today we're going to explore some of the more nuanced and complex aspects of resilience. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Denise Murray and I'm the Head of Financial Services, Compliance and Regulatory Relations here at Arthur Cox. And I'm joined today by Kieran Flynn, who's Head of our Governance and Consulting Services. What we're going to do today is share with you some insights and thoughts on how firms might approach mapping the interdependencies and interconnectedness that support an organisation's business services and their resilience position.
Great, thanks very much, Denise. Delighted to be here. For a firm to be resilient, it must ensure the end-to-end delivery of all activities it supports, its internal and external facing business services, and regardless of ICT dependencies, thinking about the interdependencies and interconnectedness between all of those things. This might seem like a daunting challenge.
Thanks, Kieran. I think it's fair to say that resilience can feel overwhelming at times, particularly as new regulations continue to make reference and cross-reference back to resilience requirements. But when we're talking to firms and when I'm engaging with firms, we always talk about going back to basics. So there's no single prescribed requirement or starting point in terms of how you're going to examine your regulations and your requirements in relation to resilience. But what we do know is that the regulator, particularly the Central Bank of Ireland, takes an outcome-based approach. So that means firms have the flexibility to choose the identification method and methodology that suits their organisation, as long as they can demonstrate that they've looked at, assessed and managed the impacts of a disruption. So maybe let's take a moment to reflect on the Central Bank of Ireland's actual expectations. So firms are required to have a level of detail that enables the identification of the resources and contributes to the delivery of each stage of the service and their importance. And secondly, that the approach and level of granularity of mapping should be sufficient for a firm to identify vulnerabilities and key dependencies, to support testing of its ability to stay within the assigned impact tolerances for each critical and important business service. Bit of a mouthful, but they're kind of our two guiding principles in the context of resilience. So when we're talking with clients, Kieran, as you know, we usually suggest starting with two things: your authorization legislation, what you're licensed to do, and your business continuity plans. That's where you've already documented your department's positions around issues that might impact your continuity. This gives a top-down and a bottom-up view of your operations, and that really positions you well then to start thinking about resilience. So if we take the top-down view first, every regulated firm has a list of services that they're authorised to provide, essentially the reason why you exist. So if we take a fund administrator, for example, the provision of fund administration services is a critical activity. But within that, you'll find the nuances of the production of the NAV and also interfacing dependencies, so the stock and cash reconciliations that support that NAV. So while the licensed activity gives you the starting point, the service, you really do have to drill in beyond that to understand the specific requirements that are involved in the end-to-end delivery of that service. So when you're doing that, you need to think about, what are your clients relying on? What are you relying on? What systems support your services? And what would cause those systems or processes to fall over, or indeed to harm you or your firm or the clients that you service? So then if we take the bottom-up approach, the business continuity plan really is a gold mine. Most firms have had these in place for a number of years. They've required their organisation's departments to document how they keep things going if a system doesn't work, if the office is closed and they can't gain access, or if a key person is unavailable. So not everything that you will have included in your business continuity plan is going to be a critical service or a critical activity, but they give you a comprehensive view of what's happening across your organisation, which ultimately speaks to resilience. So, and bringing all that back into the regulations, then that's going to allow you to think about the people, the processes, and the technology that supports your resilience position. If I link it back again to those very wordy regulations that we talked about a moment ago, and the requirement for granularity, it's really not about a box ticking exercise. If you get into that granular level of detail and understanding in relation to the services and the components of those services, it enables you to pinpoint where you may have vulnerabilities, where your processes or your systems may not be as robust as you would need them to be, what controls you may need to put in place, And ultimately will help you then determine what tolerances you have in the context of things going wrong with those services or processes. So maybe just a couple of further thoughts. When we're focused on resilience, we often think to those people, process, technology requirements, and we sometimes overlook the governance and oversight. So that's really where we're back into the regulation again. That's important. For firms operating, particularly under a delegated model or with lots of outsourcing relationships, third-party providers, the activities that take up a significant part of your day relate to the oversight of those activities. And they're essential to your overall delivery and to your control environment. So when mapping services, it's so important to include your oversight functions. They may not be time critical in the same way as client-facing issues might be, but they are absolutely central to your resilience posture.
Thanks, Denise. I couldn't agree more on that front. And I think what firms should be striving towards is finding that sweet spot between identifying a service at too high a level, that every system, third party process, and person in the organization is mapped to it, or going too granular and identifying each step in each process as its own activity. It is really about finding that Goldilocks zone in the middle that's just right for your firm. And that's going to vary between from firm to firm. So once firms have identified their business services and functions using that top-down and bottom-up approach you outlined, Denise, they will have a complete list of services that they perform in-house, as well as what services are performed by external third parties, subject to the firm's ongoing oversight and monitoring, as we touched on. The next step will be for firms to identify, classify, and tag each of those services and functions as being critical or important business services, subject to the cross-industry guidance, and which are critical or important business functions, subject to DORA. So we've outlined some of the key criteria which firms consider when it comes to criticality in our playbook. But for the purpose of this video, we're going to move on to the third stage of this process, which is mapping critical or important services and functions. And when we're talking about mapping, what we're really talking about is identifying the relevant people, processes, information, technologies, facilities, and third parties which are required to deliver those critical services and functions, and how those dependencies might interact with each other. This mapping process can take time, but it should be carried out by the employees who perform or support the relevant activity on a daily basis. There is no point in delegating this work. Similar to the identification process, you're looking to strike that balance between it being too high level and too granular. I think CrowdStrike remains that perfect example of an unknown vulnerability in the supply chain, which means that firms were unprepared when something went wrong. What that example highlighted, however, is that firms are reliant on their primary service providers to share details of their further dependencies and their fourth and fifth parties and that interconnectivity, as well as how they're working towards resolving the vulnerabilities. I'm sure Microsoft had a large number of queries, shall we say, about their supply chain and vendor management when that particular incident occurred.
For sure. And maybe we'll stay with that point for a moment because I think it's quite important. When it comes to resilience, it's often the most challenging area for firms is identifying and managing those third-party dependencies, particularly where the services are delivered, as you've just quite rightly called out there, through layers of some subcontractors. So really getting down into and understanding how that's being supported, how your service is being supported. And it becomes even more complex for a firm that's relatively a small client of a large service provider. So in those cases, the risk isn't just about the service being restored in the event of an issue. It's about whether the service is restored in a fair way and within the timeframes that maybe you've planned for in your own analysis. So as part of the identification, classification and mapping process that we've just discussed, Karen, firms should be assessing the business impact of the service and setting out clear recovery points and recovery times, objectives in that regard. But if a critical service is outsourced, the firm is ultimately reliant on the provider to meet those objectives and to do so in a way that doesn't prioritise larger clients at the expense of the smaller ones. And that's why the issue needs to be front and centre, not just during a crisis, but right from the start of the relationship. It should be considered during onboarding, built into due diligence, and reflected in the firm's outsourcing strategy. The more dependent a firm is on external providers and the smaller its footprint in that provider's ecosystem, the more it is exposed, and there may be, some more issues if things go wrong further down the supply chain. And that exposure can have a direct impact on the firm's ability to recover and maintain trust with its stakeholders.
Thanks, Denise. With that, we come to the end of this video on interconnectivity and interdependence of critical and important business functions and services. Our Resilience Playbook is a great source of information on this and further resilience topics. Join us next time for a video where we'll deal with what happens when a real-life resilience event occurs and how you can deal with it. For more about all things resilience, please visit orthocox.com/resilience.